Hello and welcome to the final session on commercial property leases, and this one focuses on lease expiry and lease renewal. So have a look at this example lease clause that relates to lease expiry. Just read this one through. So in this clause, this is covering expiry of a lease where it is expected that the tenant is going to vacate and hand the property back to the landlord. So this links back to repairing covenants and obviously alterations, if there have been any. That what it's saying is that at the end of the lease, the landlord is expecting the tenant to hand back to the landlord the property in full repair and condition, maintained, cleaned, decorated, etc. Now, obviously that what we've just talked about is handing the premises back, so the tenant coming to the end of the lease and actually vacating the property. But of course there is the other scenario, and that is that the tenant actually takes a further lease of the property. And lease expiry renewal is something that's governed by the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954. There's something here on this slide that's really critical, highlighted in red. I have talked about it previously, but with business tenancies, where the tenant is in occupation, so it's really important that the tenant is actually still occupying the premises and hasn't vacated, a lease does not automatically come to an end at the end of the lease term unless it's formally terminated by either party. So what that means is that if you as a tenant take a lease for 10 years, at the end of that 10 years the lease doesn't just come to an end automatically and you don't have to vacate. It will continue, and you continue with what's known as a tenancy at will. So you are holding over on the old lease and you can remain in occupation ad infinitum on that basis. I mean, it would be unusual that a landlord wouldn't want at some point to formalise a new lease, but that's what the law says, that you have security of tenure. At the end of the lease you can continue and remain in occupation if it's not terminated. In terms of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954, there is a clear procedure for terminating a lease and for granting a new lease. So there's two scenarios covered here. One where the landlord might want to bring a lease to an end and not grant a new lease to a tenant. They might want to, for example, redevelop the property. A landlord might want to bring the lease to an end and grant a new lease to the tenant. So they want the tenants to remain in occupation, but they want it under the terms of a new lease because they want, for example, an increased rent. The other scenarios are whereby the tenant might want a lease, so they want to initiate the current lease coming to an end and negotiate a new lease with the landlord. Or indeed the tenant business might have decided they no longer wish to be in occupation of the property, so they want to bring the lease to an end and cease their contractual obligations for that particular property. And all this is covered in the notice procedure set out in the Act. So going through this briefly, a landlord would serve a Section 25 notice to bring a lease to an end, and they can either in that notice say that they are prepared to grant a new lease to the tenant, or that they're not prepared to grant a new lease to the tenant. And in that instance they have to specify the grounds on which they're not prepared to grant a new lease to the tenant, and that's covered under Section 30 grounds A to F. I'm not going to go through all those grounds, but typical ones would be the one I've already cited, where the landlord was actually wanting to redevelop the property. So in that instance, if they can demonstrate that, then they wouldn't be required to grant a new lease to the tenant. Or the tenant hasn't been complying with their repairing obligations, or the tenant hasn't been paying their rent on time. Those are the main grounds. There are other grounds, but those are the main grounds. So the landlord's notice is a Section 25 notice, and they'd either say in that notice that they are prepared to grant a new lease and on what terms, or they're not prepared to grant a new lease and cite the relevant ground. In terms of a tenant, If a tenant wants to bring the lease to an end, they would serve a 26 notice requesting a new lease. Or they would serve a section 27 notice where they just want to bring it to an end and walk away from the property at the end of that lease. So you see it's quite complicated, quite a number of notices, and it's critical with these notices that they're served within certain time frames and that they're served to the right addresses, etc. So really, really critical that a property lawyer is involved, because getting those notices incorrect or not serving them on the right party or at the right address can make those notices invalid. And if the notices are invalid, then effectively the lease will continue. Just mapping this out a little bit, because it's really important understanding the lead up to a lease expiry date. So if the 10 years is up, for example, on the 25th of December 2015, at what point do you need to think about serving these notices? Because remember, the lease will automatically continue after the end of the term. With a section 27 notice from a tenant, so that's where they're actually saying, well, actually we want to bring this lease to an end and we're going to vacate the property and move elsewhere. That requires a minimum of 3 months notice from the tenant. Can't end it before the contractual end of the lease, but can end it after the lease, but have to give a minimum of 3 months notice. In terms of the section 25 notice from the landlord, they have to give a maximum of 12 months notice and a minimum of 6 months notice. And similarly the same with the section 26 notice of the tenant where they're wanting to renew. So in terms of the lease coming to an end, you really need to be thinking about it well in advance of a year before the expiry date, and thinking about what are you wanting. Are you wanting to remain in occupation, or are you wanting to vacate? And the other important thing is thinking about the rent, because if you've got a lease where the rent that you're paying is actually inflated, and you know that current rents are lower, so that's a market where the market's depressed, as a tenant you might want to bring that lease to an end to then negotiate a new lease at a lower rent. The opposite of that, as a landlord, if you know that rents have increased, then you might want to be thinking about bringing that lease to an end as soon as you can to negotiate a new lease at a higher rent. So the critical things, again, it's all about understanding what the lease says, understanding these diary dates, flagging up the dates. So when does the contractual term expire? So if it was from 10 years from the 1st of January, whatever, that you flag 10 years from that date. But then you also flag backwards in advance of that date 12 months. And you're very clear about notice periods for serving notice, whether you're the landlord or the tenant, to bring that lease to an end. And I mentioned about using to your advantage the market conditions. So if you've been in a period of depressed rentals, then as a tenant you might want to initiate the lease expiry and renewal as soon as possible. As a landlord you wouldn't, but where the opposite scenario, where rents have increased, as a landlord you'd want to exercise the opportunity to bring the current lease to an end and negotiate a new lease as soon as possible. So it's about understanding, is the property under rented, over rented, and what do you want to achieve, and thinking about the long-term and short-term strategy for the property, whether you are the landlord or the tenant. So again, if you're the tenant and you are thinking about relocating but you haven't found suitable alternative accommodation yet, then you might want to hold over on the current lease, so just continue paying the rent, and then when you found somewhere, if the landlord hasn't already served notice on you, you would then serve notice to bring that lease to an end at 3 months time from serving the notice. So just to put that into play a little bit, I want you to think about this scenario. So your organisation occupies an industrial unit on a 15-year lease from 24th of June 2001. As a business, you want to remain in occupation long term. The current rent being paid is less than similar units are letting for in the vicinity. So think about what dates are critical for you as a tenant. Think about what dates would be critical as the landlord, and what action might you take. Okay, thank you very much indeed.